The funeral reception was winding down when Uncle Richard cornered me by the flower arrangements. Dad had been buried 3 hours earlier, and the house was still full of relatives picking at casseroles and speaking in hushed tones about what a good man he'd been. "Natalie," Uncle Richard said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder with what anyone else might have mistaken for comfort. "We need to talk." I looked up at him, this man who had been Dad's business partner for 22 years but had never quite managed to hide his resentment that Dad owned 60% of Mitchell and Associates while Richard only owned 40%. "What about, Uncle Richard?" "About the future. About the business." He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "I want you to know that your father's share of the company will be staying in the family, but not with you." I felt my stomach drop, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "I mean your father left his share to my boys, to Kevin and Tyler. They've been working at the firm for 3 years now. They understand the business." Kevin and Tyler, my cousins who had joined Mitchell and Associates straight out of college with business degrees and attitudes that suggested they'd inherited the company already. They spent more time planning happy hour than planning client strategies, but Uncle Richard had always treated them like the second coming of Warren Buffett. "You get nothing," Uncle Richard continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The business is ours now. I'm sorry, sweetheart, but your father was realistic about your limitations." "My limitations?" "The fact that I'd dropped out of business school 8 years ago to pursue what Dad had called my art projects. The fact that I'd never shown interest in joining the family accounting firm. The fact that I lived in a small apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic and worked what they thought was a part-time job at a nonprofit." "I understand," I said quietly. Uncle Richard's expression softened slightly, probably mistaking my calm response for acceptance. "Look, Natalie, I know this is hard. But Kevin and Tyler have MBAs. They understand corporate finance. Well, you're creative, but that's not what the business needs." I nodded, watching as Kevin and Tyler stood near the kitchen, already talking animatedly with some of Dad's former clients. Already acting like the owners they apparently believed they were about to become. "The funeral was beautiful," Uncle Richard continued, apparently feeling magnanimous now that he thought he'd secured his victory. "Your father would have been proud." "Thank you. And Natalie? Don't worry about your future. We'll make sure you're taken care of. Maybe we can find you a small position at the firm. Reception work, filing, something like that." Reception work. Filing. For the daughter of the man who had built Mitchell and Associates from a 2-person operation into a firm that managed over $200 million in client assets. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom where I locked the door and pulled out my phone. I had 17 missed calls from my assistant Marina and a text that read, "The Singapore deal closed. $12.3 million. Congratulations, boss." I stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about the conversation I just had with Uncle Richard. He had no idea that his creative niece with limitations had spent the past 5 years building a digital marketing empire that generated more revenue in a single quarter than Mitchell and Associates made in an entire year. Dad had known, of course. He'd been quietly proud of my success, even if he'd never fully understood how I'd built a $67 million company from what he called computer stuff. But we'd agreed to keep it quiet from the rest of the family. Dad had said it was because he didn't want Richard to feel diminished, but I think the real reason was that he knew Richard would find some way to make my success about himself. "You're doing something incredible, Nat," Dad had told me 6 months before his heart attack. "But you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Build your empire quietly and let your work speak for itself." Now Dad was gone and Uncle Richard was already dividing up what he thought was the spoils. I splashed cold water on my face and returned to the reception, where Uncle Richard was holding court near the mantel, telling anyone who would listen about his plans for transitioning the business to the next generation. "Kevin has some innovative ideas about digital client outreach," he was saying. "And Tyler is brilliant with investment strategies. It's going to be exciting to see where they take the firm." Kevin, who was 25 and had never managed anything more complex than his own Instagram account, nodded sagely. Tyler, 23 and fresh out of business school, was already talking about disrupting the accounting space. I found Mom in the kitchen mechanically wrapping leftover food. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "I keep expecting him to walk through that door and ask if there's any more of Mrs. Henderson's potato salad," she said, tears starting to form again. "I can't believe he's really gone." "Mom, did Dad ever talk to you about his will?" She looked up from the casserole dish she was covering with foil. A little bit. Why? Uncle Richard seems to think he knows what Dad left to whom. Mom frowned. Richard has been making a lot of assumptions since your father passed. But the lawyer will sort everything out tomorrow. Tomorrow. Mr. Patterson called this morning. He wants to meet with the family at 2 p.m. to read the will. I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. What if Uncle Richard was right? What if Dad really had left his share of the business to Kevin and Tyler? Dad had always been traditional in some ways, and maybe he'd decided that business degrees trumped actual business success. The next day we gathered in the conference room at Patterson, Hughes & Associates. Uncle Richard sat at the head of the table like he was already running things. Kevin and Tyler flanked him, both wearing new suits and expressions of poorly concealed excitement. Mom sat beside me, clutching a tissue and looking lost. Mr. Patterson, Dad's lawyer for over 15 years, entered with a thick manila folder and an expression that gave nothing away. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into his chair. "I know this is a difficult time, but Robert was very specific about his wishes." Uncle Richard leaned forward. "We appreciate you handling this so efficiently, Bill. The sooner we can transition the business operations, the better for everyone." Mr. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Let's start with the will, shall we?" He opened the folder and pulled out a document that looked surprisingly thick. "The last will and testament of Robert James Mitchell," he began. "Written on March 15th of this year and properly witnessed and notarized." March 15th. That was only 4 months ago, just 2 months before Dad's heart attack. "To my brother Richard," Mr. Patterson continued, "I leave my collection of vintage fishing equipment and my 1987 Ford pickup truck, both of which hold sentimental value from our childhood." Uncle Richard's confident expression flickered slightly. "To my nephews Kevin and Tyler, I leave $25,000 each to assist with any student loans or personal debts they may have." Kevin and Tyler exchanged glances. $25,000 was nice, but it wasn't exactly inheriting a multimillion-dollar business. "To my beloved wife Margaret, I leave the house, all personal effects and $500,000 from my life insurance policy." Mom started crying softly. I took her hand. "And regarding my 60% ownership stake in Mitchell & Associates," Mr. Patterson continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone. Uncle Richard sat up straighter, clearly expecting this to be the moment his sons inherited the business. "I leave my entire 60% ownership stake along with all voting rights and operational control to my daughter Natalie Claire Mitchell." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming. Uncle Richard's face went white. "That's impossible." Mr. Patterson looked at him calmly. "I assure you it's not only possible, it's exactly what Robert wanted. But Natalie doesn't know anything about running a business." "Actually," Mr. Patterson said, pulling another document from his folder, "Robert was quite proud of Natalie's business acumen. He asked me to include a letter explaining his decision. He handed me an envelope with Dad's handwriting, 'For my brilliant daughter.' I opened it with shaking hands and read aloud. 'Natalie, by the time you read this I'll be gone and Richard will probably be very upset. I'm leaving you the business not because you need it, but because you're the only person I trust to do right by it. I know about Aurora Digital. I know about the $67 million in revenue, the 200 employees, the Fortune 500 clients. I know you built all of that while letting the family think you were just doing computer stuff part-time. I'm proud of you for building your own empire, but I'm even more proud that you did it quietly without needing anyone's approval or recognition. That's the kind of character that should run Mitchell & Associates. Richard thinks business is about MBAs and golf games and impressing clients with expensive dinners. You know, it's about actually serving people and solving their problems. The firm needs that perspective. Do whatever you think is best with the business. Sell it, keep it, transform it. I trust your judgment completely. You've already proven you can build something from nothing. Now you get to decide what to do with something that already exists. Your loving father, who was always more proud of you than you knew." I finished reading and looked around the table. Uncle Richard looked like he might be sick. Kevin and Tyler were staring at me like I'd grown a second head. $67 million? Uncle Richard whispered. "Aurora Digital," I said simply. "It's a digital marketing company. We work with Fortune 500 clients to develop comprehensive online strategies." You own a company worth $67 million? We generated $67 million in revenue last year. The company is worth significantly more than that. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. There's more to the will. Robert also established a scholarship fund with $100,000 for students pursuing business degrees, to be administered by Natalie. And, he continued, he left specific instructions about the transition of Mitchell and Associates. He wanted Natalie to have full autonomy to make whatever changes she feels are necessary. Uncle Richard found his voice again. Natalie, this is absurd. You can't just take over a business you know nothing about. Uncle Richard, I've been studying Mitchell and Associates financials for the past 2 years. What? Dad asked me to review the books as a favor. He wanted an outside perspective on the firm's digital strategy and operational efficiency. This was true. Dad had been worried about the firm's slow growth and had quietly asked me to analyze their business model. My recommendations had helped increase their client retention rate by 23% over the past 18 months. Though Richard had never known where the suggestions were coming from. In fact, I continued, I have some thoughts about how we might improve operations. Tyler spoke up for the first time. Well, that depends on whether you want to stay with the firm or pursue other opportunities. Kevin leaned forward. What kind of changes are you talking about? I looked around the table at these people who had spent years dismissing me as the family underachiever, who had planned to exclude me entirely from Dad's business legacy. I'm thinking of expanding into comprehensive financial planning and digital asset management, modernizing our client communication systems, potentially opening a second location focused on serving small business clients. Uncle Richard was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Natalie, where would you even get the capital for that kind of expansion? Uncle Richard, I could buy Mitchell and Associates outright and still have enough left over to fund the expansion from my personal assets. The room went quiet again. But I don't want to buy it, I continued. I want to earn my place in it. I want to prove that Dad's faith in me was justified. Mr. Patterson smiled. There's one more thing. Robert left a sealed envelope with specific instructions for Natalie's first month as owner. He handed me another envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Dad's handwriting. Nat, Richard is going to fight you on every decision for the first few weeks. Don't take it personally. He's scared and proud and doesn't understand how you could be successful without his help. Be patient with him, but don't let him push you around. You're the boss now. Also, Kevin has potential but needs guidance. Tyler is lazy but smart. Give them both a chance to prove themselves under your leadership before you make any major personnel decisions. I love you, Dad. I looked up at Uncle Richard, who was still processing everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes. Uncle Richard, I said gently, I know this isn't what you expected, but I'd like you to stay on as senior partner. The firm needs your experience and your client relationships. You want me to stay? I want us to work together. Dad built something good here and I think we can make it even better. What about Kevin and Tyler? I looked at my cousins who were still trying to process the fact that their useless cousin was now their boss. Kevin, I'd like you to head up our new small business division. Tyler, I want you to work with me on developing our digital asset management services. Kevin blinked. You're offering us promotions? I'm offering you opportunities. What you do with them is up to you. Over the next several hours we talked through the transition plan. By the time we left the lawyer's office, Uncle Richard had gone from hostile to curious to cautiously optimistic. Natalie, he said as we walked to our cars, I owe you an apology. For what? For underestimating you. For assuming that your success was somehow less valid because it wasn't traditional. Uncle Richard, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I spent years thinking you were wasting your potential when you were actually exceeding mine. 6 months later, Mitchell and Associates had grown by 40%. Our new digital services division was booked solid, and our small business client base had tripled. Kevin had turned out to be excellent at building relationships with entrepreneur clients, and Tyler had developed an innovative app for real-time financial tracking. Uncle Richard and I had coffee every Friday morning to discuss strategy and operations. During one of these meetings, he looked at me with something that might have been admiration. Your father would be proud, he said. I hope so. I know so. Not just because of the business success but because of how you handled everything. You could have fired me and the boys after how we treated you at the funeral. Dad's letter said to give everyone a chance to prove themselves. And if we hadn't? I smiled. Then I would have wished you well and helped you find other opportunities. Uncle Richard laughed. I always thought business was about beating the competition and maximizing profit. What do you think it's about now? Building something that serves people and lasts beyond you. As I sat in Dad's old office, now my office, looking out at the team of accountants and financial planners working to help our clients achieve their dreams, I realized that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or even businesses. It's the trust that someone places in your judgment, and the responsibility that comes with living up to that trust. Dad had known I didn't need his business to be successful. But he'd also known that his business needed someone who understood what success really meant. The will had surprised everyone except the person who mattered most. The man who'd written it, confident that his daughter would know exactly what to do with his legacy.